Hello and welcome to my very first book review video. Today I'll be talking about the novel Till We Become Monsters by Amanda Headlee, and I apologize if I pronounced that name incorrectly. I picked it up from a bookstore and I read it I think a few weeks ago at this point, so my thoughts on it have actually been stewing for quite a bit now. I finished the entire story in one day and I'm not sure if that's a good sign or a bad sign for me. The story centers around Corin Perrin, who is the main character of the novel. His grandmother often told him stories about mythical creatures and folklore, and because he was a little kid, he believed all these stories were true. One day, his grandmother tells him about changelings, and he becomes convinced that his older brother Davis is one. Then, tragically, Corin's grandmother dies. Corin blames Davis for her death, and because he also believes his brother is some sort of imposter creature, he tries to kill him. Years later, Corin agrees to a hunting trip with Davis, their father, and Davis's friend Tate. The novel falls into the horror genre, and it has some pretty intense and gory scenes, at least by the standards of me, someone who doesn't read things like that very often. So there's the basic premise of the story, and for the most part, all of that is mentioned in the summary on the back of the book. I'll try to avoid any major spoilers for the story as I talk about it, but with that out of the way, what did I think of it? Let's start with what I liked about this book. I'll begin with my first impressions. I think the cover and title of the book are very good. Till We Become Monsters is a pretty unique title, and the design of the cover is simple but super effective. It pretty easily caught my attention when I was in that bookstore browsing for books to buy and read. I also really liked the main character, Corin. The author did a pretty good job of portraying his struggles and what he deals with throughout his life. And without giving too much away, the sort of gradual reveal that Corin is a bit of an unreliable narrator was executed well, in my opinion. Branching off from Corin, I also liked the dynamics between him and his family, his brother Davis and their mother and father. They're far from a perfect family, and in fact they're pretty dysfunctional, with Davis being a sort of golden child who was always given preferential treatment, while Corin was often ignored and neglected by his parents. And the story does a very good job of showing how these differences in their upbringings affected both of them, most often for the worst. The story also featured cannibalism as a significant element of its plot and its themes. I did say earlier that this is a horror book with some gore, so don't be too surprised. Here, cannibalism is used as a metaphor for jealousy and obsession, and I think that was done pretty well. It comfortably complemented the characters and themes of the story. The scenes pertaining to or involving cannibalism definitely made me a little squeamish and uncomfortable, but since that was probably the desired effect, I'll count that as a positive rather than a negative. So, those are the biggest things that I liked about this book. Now it's time to move on to the things that I didn't like so much. The first thing I'll mention here is not an objective criticism and entirely a subjective personal opinion. The horror genre as a whole just falls outside of what I typically read. Most of the books I enjoy tend to fall into fantasy, sci-fi, or mystery, and it's a little difficult for me to genuinely enjoy a horror story. So the genre not falling within my usual preferences is a very, very small point against it, but with the asterisk that I still read it all in one day anyway. So clearly it didn't bother me that much. A minor gripe I have is the presence of a factual error at the very beginning of the book. It's stated to occur in March and takes place in the US state of Minnesota. At least I'm pretty sure it's Minnesota, but it's at the very least definitely in the northern hemisphere, but the description itself indicates that the season is autumn. In the northern hemisphere, the autumn equinox is in late September, not March. March is when spring begins, which is the entirely opposite season. Yikes. Next is another thing that's probably more subjective, but none of the characters were really likable to me. It was hard to find anyone to genuinely root for, except the literal 6-year-old child who was the younger sister of Davis's friend. I fully acknowledge that the characters probably weren't meant to be good or upstanding citizens, and it's perfectly fine to write a story where all of the characters just kinda suck. It's just not something that clicks well with me personally. I said before that I liked the dynamics between the family, and especially between Corin and Davis, but it seemed like like the reveal that Davis maybe wasn't such a bad person came a little too suddenly and a little too late. He's first presented as someone who's very selfish and attention-seeking, and his antics were often what caused his parents to neglect Corin. Then, kind of out of nowhere, he's shown to maybe be more caring than he seems. On the one hand, this does make sense with Corin's role as an unreliable narrator. His view of Davis is biased, so of course his description and perception of him will always paint him in the worst light possible. On the other hand, though, I wish there had been a little more to foreshadow Davis's kinder side or to cast doubt on Corin's view of him. The narration was kind of dull, and it included a lot more telling than showing, although I do think that improved throughout the story. It could just be the author's writing style, but I didn't personally enjoy it. Finally, there's my thoughts on the use of the Wendigo from Native American folklore. My opinion on it is pretty mixed. It works with the use of cannibalism as a metaphor, since the tales of the Wendigo center entirely around cannibalism. At the same time, though, the Wendigo feels kind of overused in the horror genre. I think any mention of the Wendigo could probably be safely removed from the story without affecting it too much, and that change might even do a better job of reinforcing the theme of people being the real monsters. So now I've talked about the things I liked and the things I didn't really like. Now it's time for the final category. And here come my biggest complaints about this book. First is, I think, the most obvious problem with the book, and the one I saw the most people complaining about when I read other reviews for it. There is a borderline, not even borderline, it's just an unacceptable number of typos in the story. I might sound like I'm being too harsh, but it is a little embarrassing for a published story to have as many typos and mistakes as this one does. Early on, the spelling of a minor character's name changes no less than twice. There are multiple errors with dialogue punctuation and capitalization, and at least one instance of the wrong word being used in place of a similar sounding one. I can excuse a typo or two in most books, but especially in one this short, the number of typos I spotted was awful. Either there was no editor to catch these mistakes for some reason, or whatever editor the book did have just didn't look hard enough. There's also a character I feel was largely unnecessary, and that's Maeve, who is Corin's girlfriend. She sort of added and contributed nothing. She could be removed from the story and it would remain almost exactly the same. There are too many points of view, including from minor characters who never show up again, even just by being mentioned. Similarly, there was one instance of head-hopping late into the story. With no warning at all, the POV shifted from one character directly to another. And no, the book was not written in third-person omniscient, it was third-person limited for the entire rest of the story. And lastly, I felt like a not insignificant chunk of the story was just not needed. This sort of comprises two parts of it. First is the time Corin spends in an asylum after trying to kill Davis, and the second occurs after the time skip when Corin is in college before heading back home for the hunting trip. What's particularly strange to me is the amount of time the reader spends in these sections despite there being absolutely no mention of them in the summary on the back. A book summary should only cover about a third of the story at the absolute maximum, but it's not until well beyond that point that we finish reading what's mentioned in the summary. As a final branching point, the summary is somewhat inaccurate. It implies Corin wants to use the hunting trip as a way to spend time with his father and Davis and make amends with them, but in the actual story, that's not his intention at all. He only begrudgingly agrees to go on the trip, and he doesn't really want to be there. So yeah, that concludes my biggest criticisms. Overall, I would give Till We Become Monsters a 5 out of 10. It's not amazing by any means, and despite all of its flaws, I find it hard to say it's downright terrible, so it lands somewhere in the middle for me. I know I listed a lot more criticisms, but I really do think that the things the author did well, she did extremely well. Not enough to overcome the flaws that I pointed out, but enough to sort of balance them. If you really don't enjoy horror stories, especially ones with some gore or violence, then I can't recommend this book to you. It's probably not something you would enjoy. But if you do like horror and you don't mind some gore and typos, then I say give it a shot. I saw reviews from people who enjoyed this book way more than I did, so clearly there's an audience for it. As far as I know, this is the author's first published novel. Writing and publishing a novel are not easy tasks, so she does deserve some props for just those alone. It's very rough around the edges, and although it had a lot of potential, it feels like there was just an entire round of editing and revision that never happened, and that really drags it down. It kept me hooked enough to read it all in one day though, and I still think the cover is really cool. That's about all for this video. I might make more book reviews in the future, but I don't know, it depends on how much I read and if I feel strongly enough about a book to make a review about it. Thanks for watching, check out Till We Become Monsters if you're interested, and have a good day.